Ren Calloway had been on her feet for 14 hours, and every one of them had led to this moment. The ballroom of the Halcyon Hotel glowing gold under 3,000 fairy lights, 200 guests seated at tables draped in ivory silk, and a bride sweeping down the aisle toward a wedding that existed, in its entirety, because Ren had built it out of nothing but a budget, a deadline, and her own refusal to fail. She was 22 years old, and this was the largest wedding she had ever run alone. Her boss had handed her the file 8 months ago with the casual cruelty of someone testing whether a junior planner would sink or swim, and Ren had swum. Through vendor cancellations, a flower shortage 2 weeks out, a groom's mother who changed the seating chart 4 times, and a bride who treated every phone call like an inconvenience Ren existed solely to absorb. She had absorbed it. That was the job. You absorbed the chaos, so the 2 people at the center of it got to remember only the beauty. The ceremony went off exactly as planned, every candle lit on cue, every note of the string quartet landing where it should. Ren stood near the service entrance in her black suit, earpiece humming with updates from her team, and allowed herself 30 seconds of something close to pride as the bride, Yuna Cho, said her vows in a voice trembling with what looked, from a distance, like genuine emotion. It was during the reception that everything went wrong. Ren had positioned herself near the head table, coordinating the timing of the toasts with the caterers, when Yuna rose from her seat mid-course, wine glass in hand, and crossed the ballroom floor with the particular fury of a woman who had found something to be furious about. She stopped in front of Ren, close enough that the guests at the nearest tables went quiet, sensing the shift the way a room senses a change in air pressure before a storm breaks. "You put my cousin at table 14, Yuna said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Table 14. Do you understand what that says about our family?" Ren kept her voice level, the voice she'd trained into herself over 3 years of absorbing other people's chaos. "The seating chart was approved by your mother 2 weeks ago, Miss Cho. If there's an error, I can fix it right now, quietly, without." "I don't want quiet," Yuna said. "I want you to understand that you had one job today, and you have humiliated my family in front of 200 people. The ballroom had gone fully silent now, silverware suspended over plates, the string quartet's bows frozen mid-stroke at some unseen signal from the bandleader who clearly sensed a scene was unfolding and wanted no part of scoring it. "You know what?" Yuna continued, louder, her voice carrying a cruelty that had clearly been simmering under the surface of pleasantries for months. "Maybe you don't belong out here at all. Maybe you belong back there." She gestured, with her wine glass, toward the far corner of the ballroom where the staff table sat, half hidden behind a folding screen, meant for caterers and photographers on their breaks. "That's where the help sits. Not next to my guests. Not near my family. Back there, with the rest of the people we're paying to be invisible." The words landed the way words land, when they're designed to. Ren felt heat climb up the back of her neck, felt 200 pairs of eyes settle on her with the particular discomfort of witnesses who don't know whether to look away or lean in. She had absorbed worse before. Every planner had a catalog of bridezilla stories, but there was something in the specific cruelty of it. The word help delivered like a slur, the gesture toward the staff table like Ren was cattle being redirected to a pen, that made her hands go very still at her sides. She opened her mouth to say something professional, something that would de-escalate and preserve the wedding she'd spent 8 months building, when a voice cut across the silence from the far side of the room, quiet, even, but somehow louder than Yuna's had been, the way a single dropped pin can be louder than a shout in the right kind of silence. "That's an interesting thing to say," the voice said, "about the only person in this room who has done her job perfectly today." Every head turned. The man who had spoken was seated at table 3, near the front, close enough to the head table that Ren realized with a small cold jolt she had clocked him earlier without registering who he was. A man in his mid-30s in a black suit with no tie, dark hair combed back, sitting alone at a table that should have held 6 people. The other 5 chairs conspicuously empty around him like furniture arranged by unspoken agreement rather than any seating chart Ren had made. She remembered now, distantly, a note from the groom's family 2 months ago. "Table 3. Do not seat anyone with Mr. Song. He prefers to sit alone." No explanation given. She had assumed eccentric investor. She had not asked further, because the fee attached to that particular instruction had been generous enough to buy her silence twice over. Yuna's face did something complicated, surprise, then a flicker of something that looked almost like fear before she smoothed it back into composure. "Mr. Song," she said, her voice suddenly smaller than it had been a moment ago. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me now," the man said, rising from his chair with an unhurried economy of movement that somehow made every other person in the room feel like they were moving too fast by comparison. He crossed the ballroom floor, and Ren watched the way the crowd seemed to part slightly around him without anyone actually stepping aside, the way water reorganizes itself around a stone dropped into a still pond. He stopped in front of Ren, and up close she could see the details she'd missed from across the room, a thin white scar along his jaw, the kind that suggested a blade rather than an accident, and eyes so dark they looked black under the ballroom's gold lighting, and a stillness to him that felt less like calm and more like a held breath. "What's your name?" he asked her, and something in the way he said it made it clear he already suspected the answer mattered more than the question implied. "Ren Calloway," she said, because there was nothing else to say, and because some instinct told her that lying to this man, even by omission, would be a mistake she couldn't afford. "Ren Calloway," he repeated, like he was committing the syllables to memory. He turned to face the room fully then, and his voice, when it came again, had shifted into something with a harder edge underneath the same quiet register. "This woman built this wedding out of nothing but a spreadsheet and 8 months of 18-hour days. I know because I had my people look into every vendor on this file before I agreed to attend, and her name came up more than anyone else's, vendors calling her relentless, meticulous, the reason 3 separate disasters never reached this room tonight. And you," he turned back to Yuna, and whatever warmth had briefly touched his voice when speaking to Ren evaporated entirely. "You just told 200 people that the person responsible for all of it belongs at a folding table behind a screen." Yuna's mouth opened and closed. "Mr. Song," she started again, "I didn't mean—"
"You meant exactly what you said," he said.
"That's what makes it worth correcting." He turned back to Ren. "There's an empty chair at my table," he said. "Table 3. It's been empty all evening, because I don't like company I haven't chosen myself. I'd like to choose yours." The ballroom held its breath the way ballrooms do when several hundred strangers simultaneously realize they are witnessing something they will talk about for years. Ren stood there in her black suit, earpiece still humming faintly with the coordinator asking if everything was all right, and understood on some level that whatever she said next would be the thing everyone remembered about this wedding, more than the flowers, more than the vows, more than the 4-tier cake sitting untouched at the edge of the room. "I have a job to finish," she said finally, because it was true, and because some stubborn part of her refused to let this moment, however strange, however unexpected the rescue, become the whole story of her night. "I have 3 more courses to coordinate and a first dance to cue in 20 minutes. Something shifted in his expression, not disappointment, she realized, but something closer to interest, like she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking.
"Then I'll wait," he said.
20 minutes. "And when your job is finished, the chair will still be here." He returned to his table without another word, without acknowledging Yuna again, without acknowledging the 200 guests whose whispered conversations were already rekindling around the room like a fire finding fresh air. Ren straightened her jacket with hands that were not quite steady and pressed 2 fingers to her earpiece. "Resume service," she said quietly to her team. "Course 3 in 5 minutes. First dance on schedule." She finished her job. She always finished her job. But every few minutes, without meaning to, she found her eyes drifting to table 3, where Minho Song sat alone, unmoving, watching the room with the patience of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry toward anything he actually wanted. The wedding wound down close to midnight, the last of the guests trickling toward the valet stand in 2s and 3s, and Ren spent the final hour doing what she always did, checking the vendor teardown, confirming the final invoice details with the hotel's event manager, making sure the bride's discarded veil made its way into the correct garment bag instead of the trash the exhausted catering staff had nearly swept it into. By the time she finished, the ballroom had emptied to almost nothing, a skeleton crew folding chairs, and one man still seated at table 3, exactly where he'd said he would be. "You waited," she said, walking toward him because it seemed rude not to, and because some part of her that had been humming with adrenaline since Yuna's outburst wanted, badly, to understand what had just happened to her evening. "I said I would," he said, standing as she approached, an old-fashioned courtesy that felt strange coming from a man who'd just publicly dismantled a bride's cruelty in front of 200 witnesses. "Minho Song," he said, extending a hand. "Though I suspect you've already guessed, I'm not simply an investor with a preference for solitary seating." "I assumed eccentric," Ren admitted, shaking his hand and finding his grip careful, deliberate, like a man who had learned to modulate his own strength around people he hadn't decided to hurt. "Should I have assumed something else?" "You should have assumed exactly what your instincts told you when you saw an empty table with 5 chairs and a note asking you not to fill them," he said. "Instincts that specific don't come from nowhere." "I try not to ask questions that aren't mine to ask," Ren said. "It's a survival skill in my line of work."
"It's a rare one," he said.
"Most people either ask too much or perform not asking so loudly it becomes its own question. You did neither. You simply worked." They stood there a moment, the ballroom emptying around them, and Ren found herself studying him the way she studied vendors on a first meeting, looking for the tell, the crack in the presentation that told her what she was actually dealing with. She found none. Whatever Minho Song was, he had built himself the way she built weddings, seamlessly, with every visible edge sanded down to nothing. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, and he inclined his head in permission. "Why did you do that? Stand up for me, I mean. You didn't know me an hour before tonight." He considered the question with a seriousness that suggested he didn't often get asked things directly, that most people around him were too careful or too afraid to ask him anything at all. "Because I have sat through more of these events than I can count," he said, "and I have watched people like Yuna Cho humiliate people like you 100 times, and every other time I said nothing because it wasn't my business and because staying uninvolved has kept a great many things simpler for me over the years. Tonight, I found I couldn't manage it. I don't entirely know why yet. I suspect I will figure it out." "That's an honest answer," she said. "I wasn't expecting one. Most people who meet me don't get honest answers," he said. "Consider it a rare exception, Miss Calloway." He offered to have his driver take her home, and Ren, against every instinct that told her a woman did not get into cars with strange men who silenced entire ballrooms with 6 sentences, found herself saying yes, not because she trusted him yet, but because something in her, the same something that had kept her rooted at 18-hour weddings long after exhaustion, should have sent her home, wanted to know more about a man who had chosen, in a room full of witnesses, to spend his social capital on a wedding planner nobody important was supposed to notice. The car was quiet, black, driven by a man who never once glanced in the rearview mirror at either of them, and Minho sat with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that silence unsettled other people far more than it unsettled him. "Can I ask you something else?" Ren said, watching the city lights slide past the window. "What do you actually do, Mr. Song? Because I looked into every vendor and guest attached to that wedding file, same as you apparently looked into me, and your name came back with nothing. No company. No public record beyond a name on a guest list." "That's by design," he said. "And I'd rather not lie to you about what I do, because I think you'd see through it, and I think you deserve better than being lied to by the second man who's spoken to you tonight. I run an organization that most people in this city are careful not to name directly. You'd call it a syndicate. I'd call it a family business, inherited from a father who built it out of nothing, and left it to me along with every consequence that came attached." Ren felt something in her chest go very still, the particular stillness of a person recalculating every risk in a situation they'd already committed to. "And you're telling me this in a car, at midnight," she said carefully. "I'm telling you this because you're the kind of person who notices when something doesn't add up," he said. "You'd have noticed eventually, and I'd rather you hear it from me now, plainly, than piece it together later and wonder what else I'd hidden." "Why does that matter to you?" Ren asked. "What I think of you, I mean." "You don't know me." "I know enough," he said. "I watched you work a room for 4 hours without a single visible crack, and I watched you refuse an escape from public humiliation because you had a job to finish. That tells me more about a person than most conversations I've had this year. She should have asked him to stop the car. She thought about it, genuinely considered it, weighing the sensible fear against the strange, magnetic pull of a man who spoke about danger the way other people discuss the weather. Instead, she asked, "Is that why table 3 sat empty? Because whoever might have wanted to hurt you would have gone through the people sitting closest." Something flickered behind his eyes, surprise maybe, or something closer to respect. "Yes," he said simply. "It's a habit built out of necessity. 3 years ago, someone tried to reach me through a woman I cared about. She survived. It cost her more than I've ever been able to make right, and I promised myself afterward that I would not let anyone close enough again to pay that price on my behalf." "I'm sorry," Ren said, and meant it.
"Don't be," he said.
"It taught me something useful.
Distance keeps people alive."
I've simply never found it particularly easy to maintain, not because I lack discipline, but because discipline was never really the problem. The problem was always that some part of me kept wanting things I decided I couldn't have." The car pulled up outside her apartment building before she could ask what he meant, and he walked her to the door with the same old-fashioned courtesy he'd shown at the reception, stopping 2 respectful steps back once they reached it.
"Thank you for tonight," she said.
"Both for the chair, and for not lying to me in the car." "I'd like to see you again," he said. "Not because I think it's wise. Because I've spent 3 years being careful, and tonight was the first night in a long time I forgot to be." She should have said no. Instead, she gave him her number, written on the back of a vendor receipt because it was the only paper in her bag, and watched his car pull away into the dark with a feeling in her chest she didn't have a professional word for. She lay awake a long time that night, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, replaying the ballroom in her head the way she always replayed her weddings afterward, checking for mistakes, for moments she should have handled differently. But the moment she kept returning to wasn't the humiliation. It was the second before Minho stood up, when she had braced herself to swallow the insult the way she'd swallowed 100 smaller ones before, and some part of her, some tired and worn-down part, had simply decided she wasn't going to do it gracefully this time. She hadn't said anything. She hadn't needed to. But she recognized, lying there in the dark, that the version of herself who might have quietly walked to the staff table without protest was a version she was tired of being. She thought about her mother, who had cleaned hotel rooms for 20 years and taught Ren that dignity wasn't about the room you were allowed to sit in. It was about the way you carried yourself inside whatever room life handed you. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent building a reputation vendor by vendor, referral by referral, without a single family name or trust fund behind her, and how close she had come tonight to having all of it reduced to a single cruel sentence about where the help belonged. And she thought, uneasily, about the fact that the person who had refused to let that sentence stand was a man whose name apparently made an entire ballroom go quiet before anyone explained why. She still didn't fully understand what that meant. But she understood, falling asleep near 2 in the morning with her phone still in her hand, that she wanted to find out. He called 2 days later, and the days after that turned into something Ren hadn't planned for and couldn't quite categorize. Dinners in restaurants where the staff treated Minho with a deference that had nothing to do with generous tipping, walks through the city at hours when most people were asleep, conversations that circled closer and closer to honesty each time they spoke. She learned that his given name meant something like bright light in the language his grandfather had spoken, that he read history books late into the night because he found the patterns of empires rising and falling more honest than most conversations he had during the day, that the woman he'd mentioned in the car, Hannah, a name he said only once, carefully, like something still tender to the touch, had been the closest thing to family he'd had outside the organization itself, and that her survival, 3 years ago, had come at the cost of an injury that kept her out of the city entirely now, living somewhere quieter, somewhere he visited when he could and never spoke about beyond the fact of it. 3 weeks into whatever this had become, Ren found herself standing in her own kitchen at 11 at night, phone in hand, staring at a text from an unknown number that had arrived after a full week of unnervingly precise silence from every source that mattered to her life. "We know who you've been seeing. Distance yourself, or we will do it for you." She called Minho immediately, and something in her voice must have carried the fear through the line before she finished a full sentence, because he arrived at her apartment in under 15 minutes, dressed like he'd left somewhere important without bothering to explain why, jaw set in a way she hadn't seen since the ballroom. "Show me," he said, and she handed him her phone. His expression didn't change, exactly, but something behind it went very cold, very controlled, in a way that made Ren understand, more fully than any story he'd told her, what kind of man she'd let into her life. "This is Dae-sung-on's work," he said finally. "He spent 2 years trying to find a way into my territory that doesn't involve a direct war he knows he'd lose. He's decided the way in is you." "Then tell me what to do," Ren said, and she meant it as a genuine question, not a request for rescue. "I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to let me understand the shape of this, so I can decide what I'm willing to risk." "That's not a question most people ask me," he said, something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. "Most people want me to make the danger disappear without explaining it to them. You want to understand it first. I've spent my whole career managing other people's crises without ever getting a say in what those crises actually were," she said. "I'm not doing that with my own life." He told her everything, then, the shape of Dae-sung-on's ambition, the 2 years of quiet skirmishes that had never quite tipped into open war, the fact that On had clearly done exactly what Minho himself had done at the wedding, had someone dig into every person connected to Minho's life until they found the one thread that hadn't existed 3 weeks earlier. That thread was Ren. "I could send you somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere On couldn't reach.
It would mean not seeing you for a while.
It would mean the safest version of this ending badly, quietly, without either of us ever finding out what it could have been." "Or," Ren said. "Or you stay," he said, "and I do something I've spent 3 years telling myself I'd never do again, which is let someone close enough to be a target and trust that this time, I end the threat before it ends anything else." "I'm staying," she said, before he'd even finished the sentence. "I didn't survive 8 months of Yuna Cho's wedding by running from difficult people, Minho. I'm not about to start with this one." Something in his face broke open then, the careful composure cracking just slightly, and he crossed the distance between them and kissed her, the first time either of them had let the tension underneath every conversation become something real, and it felt less like romance and more like a decision, deliberate and irreversible, the kind neither of them would be able to take back afterward even if they'd wanted to. They didn't speak of Dae-sung-on again that night, not directly, but the shape of the threat sat in the room with them all the same, the way a storm sits on the horizon even when the sky overhead is still clear. Ren spent the following 3 days in a strange, suspended version of her normal life, meeting with clients about spring weddings, approving floral orders, answering emails about seating charts for people whose biggest worry was a difficult mother-in-law, while somewhere beneath the surface of all of it, she understood that Minho's men had quietly begun watching her building, her office, the coffee shop where she met vendors most mornings. She noticed a car she didn't recognize parked outside her apartment 2 mornings running and understood, without being told, exactly whose it was. On the 3rd night, Minho came to her apartment not for dinner or conversation but to tell her, plainly, that On had escalated. A delivery of flowers meant for one of her upcoming weddings had been intercepted and replaced with an arrangement of black orchids and a card with no name, only the words, "We are closer than you think." Ren stood in her kitchen holding the card, feeling something cold settle low in her stomach, and found that underneath the fear was something else entirely, a hardening resolve she hadn't expected of herself. "He wants me frightened enough to beg you to send me away," she said, setting the card down carefully on the counter, like it might still be dangerous to hold. "I'm not going to give him that." "You don't have to prove anything to him," Minho said, watching her with an expression she was learning to read as something close to worry, though he wore it the way he wore everything, folded down small and controlled. "I'm not proving anything to him," she said. "I'm deciding something for myself. There's a difference, and it's the same difference I tried to explain to Yuna Cho at that wedding. I don't exist to be moved around by other people's plans for me. Not hers. Not On's. Not even yours if it came to that." Something crossed his face at that. Not offense, she realized, but a kind of quiet recalibration, like he was recognizing a boundary he hadn't expected to find and respected all the more for its unexpectedness.
Then tell me what you need from me, he said.
Not what I think you need. What you're actually asking for. I need you to stop deciding things about my safety without telling me first, she said. I need you to trust that I can hold difficult information without falling apart. And I need you to finish this the way you know how to finish it, because I've seen enough of your world now to understand that on isn't the kind of problem that goes away on its own. He nodded slowly, like she'd handed him terms he could actually work with. Then that's what happens, he said. And I need you to understand what finishing it will look like, because I won't pretend to you that it will be clean.
I don't need it clean, she said.
I need it over. The confrontation came 4 days later, in a warehouse near the docks that Minho's people used for meetings too delicate for anywhere with witnesses, and Ren insisted on being there despite every argument he raised against it. If On wants to use me as leverage, she said, standing in the passenger seat of his car with her arms crossed, then the worst thing you can do is hide me somewhere he can still reach. The best thing you can do is let him see that I'm not leverage. I'm a person who chose to stand here. Dae-sung arrived with 6 men to Minho's 4, and the warehouse filled with the particular tension of 2 forces that both understood exactly how badly this could go. On was younger than Ren expected, sharp-featured, with the restless energy of a man who had spent 2 years wanting something he couldn't quite reach. You brought her, On said, eyes flicking to Ren with open amusement. That's either very brave or very stupid, Minho. I was hoping to use her as a reason for you to finally make a mistake. Instead, you've handed her to me directly. I didn't hand her anything, Minho said, voice flat and utterly certain. She came because she decided to. That's the part you don't understand about people like her, Dae-sung. You built your entire plan around the assumption that she'd be afraid enough to make herself useful to you.
She isn't.
On's smile faltered slightly. We'll see, he said, and gestured to one of his men, who moved fast toward Minho's blind side in the half-second it took for the room to shift from negotiation into violence. Ren saw it first. She'd learned, over 3 weeks, to read Minho's stillness the way she read a ballroom before it turned, the way you feel the air change before anyone else notices, and she shouted a warning sharp enough to buy him the half-second he needed to turn and meet the attack before it landed. The warehouse dissolved into motion, controlled and brutal, Minho's men closing the distance with the same economical precision he'd shown her in every quiet moment since the wedding, and Ren, rather than freezing, grabbed a length of pipe from a stack of construction materials against the far wall and used it to redirect a second attacker's arm just enough to give one of Minho's soldiers the opening he needed. It ended in under 2 minutes. Dae-sung, On, cornered and out of options, made the mistake of reaching for a weapon that wasn't fast enough, and Minho closed the distance before it cleared its holster, ending 2 years of quiet warfare in a single decisive movement that Ren understood, without needing further explanation, was the price this world demanded and had been demanding since long before she'd walked into it. When it was over, Minho turned to find her standing exactly where he'd left her, pipe still in hand, breathing hard but upright. You were supposed to stay by the door, he said, and there was no real reprimand in it, only something close to disbelief. I did stay by the door, she said. I just didn't stay useless while I was there. The weeks after On's death moved strangely, the particular quiet that follows a resolved war, and Minho's organization absorbed what remained of On's territory without much resistance, the city quietly reorganizing itself around an order that no longer had 2 competing claims pulling at its edges. Ren went back to work, because the wedding industry did not pause for anyone's personal upheaval, and found, to her own surprise, that her name had begun circulating in new circles, not because of the danger, which stayed carefully out of public record, but because of the story that had already spread through every wedding vendor in the city, the planner who'd been humiliated in front of 200 guests and defended, publicly, by a man nobody had expected to speak up at all. Yuna Cho sent her a stiff, unconvincing apology 3 weeks later, which Ren accepted with the same professional grace she'd have extended to any difficult client, because grudges were expensive and she had a business to run. She didn't need Yuna's approval anymore. She'd already gotten something far more valuable out of that wedding than a 5-star review. On a quiet evening 2 months after the warehouse, Ren sat across from Minho at a small restaurant table. No cameras, no witnesses, No ballroom full of strangers deciding what to make of them, and asked him the question she'd been circling for weeks. "Do you regret any of it?"
she asked.
"The wedding. What you said to Yuna. Everything that followed because of it." Minho considered the question with the same careful precision he brought to everything, turning his glass slowly between two fingers. "I regret that it took watching someone humiliate you in front of 200 people for me to remember what it felt like to want something enough to risk it," he said finally. "I don't regret a single choice I made after that. Not one." "And if it happened again," she asked, "if some new threat came for everything you've built because of me, would you choose differently?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes, the same eyes that had watched her from across a ballroom with unreadable stillness, had opened in a way she now understood wasn't going to close again. "No," he said simply. "I spent 3 years telling myself distance was the only way to keep the people I cared about alive. You taught me that the cost of that distance was its own kind of loss. I'd rather face every danger this city can produce with you standing next to me than survive it alone and call that safety." Ren reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand that had crossed a ballroom to stand between her and a room full of silent witnesses, and found, as she always did now, that it was steady and warm and entirely hers.